Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Susan Lindner, your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show, where we get behind the innovation and talk about the stories that actually move this fantastic industry forward. And I want to say, I feel like every show I come on and say, I'm so excited about my guest today. But what's really interesting about my guest today is that I feel like we're kind of turning the discussion around venture capital on its head. The conversation around VC is always smart VC with a big chunk of change goes and looks for a cool startup to have this phenomenal exit or IPO, right? This grandiose acquisition or IPO. But we don't ever actually talk about how someone becomes a venture capitalist, how you actually learn the skills of venturing, and especially if you're in innovation in a large corporation and you know you need to put startups in the mix of your innovation portfolio, how do you actually learn the skills of corporate venturing in order to do this successfully? So you're not just a giant merger or acquisition mill with startups that don't make it to the finish line once you've acquired them. So that's why I really want to get into it today with my guest, Andy Goldstein. Andy is a passionate serial entrepreneur and startup investor with more than 40 years of global experience in founding, building, financing, and accelerating companies. Currently, Andy serves as a partner in the global VC fund VU Venture Partners and at Venture University, where he's focused on VC investments and closing the gap in Europe for investor education across VC, private equity, and angel investing. Andy's expertise lies in helping European companies expand globally and US companies enter the European market. His journey has spanned co-founder MD roles across major organizations like the LMU Entrepreneurship Center, Deloitte Digital Ventures, German Entrepreneurship, which recently rebranded as the Start 2 Group, where I am also a mentor, the German Accelerator Program, and the Social Entrepreneurship Academy, and numerous other startups. He's also the co-founder of accelerator programs that have empowered more than 1,000 startups and produced 9 unicorns. Andy, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I'm really excited to dive into our conversation.
Susan, thanks so much for having me and for that very nice introduction. And I'm also really looking forward to it. I think you've really hit the nail on the head with what you're doing around corporate innovation and storytelling. So glad to be here.
Well, let's get into it. So I want to first understand a little bit about your own path, Andy. So how did you come to this place of innovation and investing? And how did it all begin for you? Why did you choose this path?
So I'm a Philadelphian by birth. I studied international business and entrepreneurial management at the Wharton Business School in Philadelphia. And at the age of 22, I couldn't find anyone to hire me to run their international business. So I decided to,
What?
yeah,
At 22,
surprising.
nobody would give you
Yeah, at 22, nobody wanted to hire me, even despite my bachelor's degree. Imagine that.
what?
And yeah, and so I decided to start my own company. And the IBM PC was just launching, and a college roommate and myself, we decided that there would be a big need for software in Europe that needed to be translated. And so we moved to Germany and we started importing US software and translating it. The fact that I had never touched a computer before and spoke no German did, however, lead to a 12 to 14-year learning curve, but I did eventually figure it out. So that's how I got into it. I sold my second company after around 20 years in. And that was the first time I really got into corporate innovation because I sold this software licensing business to a large public company out of France.
Wow. So a venture that was 20 years in the making.
It was. I was an overnight success. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how different is that, right? From the expectations of venture funded. You weren't venture funded though, right? You were
No,
bootstrapping the whole thing.
yeah. In fact, I often say that venture capital was the best thing that never happened to me because
Uh,
when I sold my company, I owned 60% and my partners owned 40. So you don't need such a big exit when you own 100% of the company.
True, but maybe, the rationale from some of the VCs I've had on this show is, maybe if you had a couple of VCs kicking your butt, sitting on your board, providing you some strategic insights, you might have gotten to that exit with a little less equity in 5 years' time as opposed to 20 years' time. What do you think about that?
Well, now that I'm on the other side and I am a VC, and I did then set up the entrepreneurship program at the Munich University and ran that for almost 16 years. And I'm a full believer in what you just said, that venture-backed companies are far and away also statistically the ones that are, the most successful. So I think the more important thing as an entrepreneur is to deeply understand whether or not you're really a venture case. And there's just very, very few companies that are really venture cases. And that's why VCs say no to, virtually 99% of all the deals they look at.
I spent 6 summers at the World Series of Poker representing professional poker players as a publicist. My job was to get them, picking stocks ahead of stock pickers in the Wall Street Journal and seeing who would do better, the World Series of Poker champion or some high flying dude at Morgan Stanley, right? But it's very interesting to me that, and I think Warren Buffett kind of, based on the deal flow he talks about and so forth, it's you turn down about 80% of what you're looking at. And
venture is much higher than that.
Right. Maybe it's 95, right? You'll turn down 95, you'll consider another 2%, and you'll fund maybe 1-2%.
Less, yeah.
Less, right.
Yeah, less.
So
points of percentage,
right.
Yeah.
So let's get into a little bit of the conversation around the corporate side, because what I hear on this show now, 200 plus episodes in, is that there are a lot of corporate innovators who kind of are trepidatious around working with startups. I've shared this on the show before, but I can recall pitching a senior innovation person at Coca-Cola who told me that we don't do startups anymore here. And I said, what do you mean you don't do startups? And he said, we unintentionally murder startups. They come to our door, we think they're amazing. A business unit says, I want to work with these guys. And the first row of our IT team says, well, it's got to be checked for the 9,000 security holes that we're going to find. It needs to be localized in 137 languages from jump. And then we'll have a conversation as to whether or not, we can actually make this work.
Yeah.
So like when you conceptualize, most of the folks who come on this show talk about corporate venturing in light of a portfolio. They look at risk as a potential. They look at market as potential. If you're bringing corporate venturing into the discussion, how do you begin to conceptualize venture capital investing as a corporate innovator if you haven't done it before?
Yeah. I think it starts with a very basic truth.
Okay.
That you do need to hold underneath the nose of the corporate until they realize that it is a basic truth. It's pretty simple.
What does that smell like exactly, Andy?
It smells like this, and I'm sure it'll resonate with you quickly. 99.9, I would just say let's round it up to 100, but if you want to be conservative, let's round it down to 98. But percent of all tech breakthroughs that we've seen in the last 50 years have come from startups. Literally everything. I know they're not startups anymore, they're big companies, but literally the real cutting edge technology, new things, statistically all comes from startups. All. Everything in corporate for the most part is incremental, right? So once you realize that all breakthrough technology is coming from startups, you eventually come around to the thinking that if I don't have an industrialized approach inside my company for dealing with startups, my chances of really coming up with a breakthrough technology and transforming my business thereby is very, very low. And once corporates realize that it is coming from the startups, they change their tune and they start understanding, aha, that's where corporate venturing, I have to be open to that. I don't think that they're open to it per se in the most pragmatic ways, but they do become open to it.
So you and I were talking before we hit record here, and I had a fantastic professor on from Babson. Check out the episode just before Andy's, where we discussed this a little bit too. And she was pushing back, saying that corporate innovation, there's corporate innovation when it comes to product, right? And maybe even service. But the greatest impact to the innovation landscape for virtually any company is business model shift. And it's rare that a startup brings business model shift to a giant company as opposed to new product line or new integration with, new markets that can be tapped based on a market that allows as a wedge to increase new opportunities for the mothership. But creating real innovative change around business model, revenue generation, et cetera, often comes from the mothership instead.
Yes. Yes. And that's what I'm saying as well, that it is this sort of incremental changes of my business model. It's just the way that is, and the corporate has such a massive market, penetration, and has clients and has all of those things that they need. And so they're able to, it's the innovator's dilemma, right? From way back when. It's like that incrementalness is where corporates go forward, and it's not in the breakthrough. So at the same time, if you look at the companies who really are creating massive value, look at an Apple, right? Let's look back remember way back, there was something called desktop publishing. People
Yeah.
used to call it that. Remember, there was a little company called Adobe that came out. They were a startup, right? Adobe was a little startup, yeah. And Apple was, the first one that said, "Look, we're not going to build this ourselves. We're going to work with a startup." Right. And so Apple is one of if you look inside the iPhone, right, you're going to find startups galore. So Apple knows how to, Apple has a conveyor belt system set up in their company for dealing with startups. They do it all the time. And then they integrate it, and then they do what the professor is saying. They say, well, we're migrating our business model. And in order to leapfrog where we are today, we're not going to build that piece of technology. We're going to, so it's not it's not one or the other. It's not like work with startups and startups are going to save the world. No, it's like a startup can probably save you 2 to 3 years of bringing your product to market, because they have an innovation that's going to allow you to come to market 2 years before your competitor. That in and of itself can be, that can change your entire business, right? So, but there's so few companies that have figured out how to do, there is something called venture clienting. It's a concept that actually comes out of Europe. And it's about, how do I, as a corporate, become a client of a startup? And how do I industrialize that process? Because here's the thing, if you look at CVC, corporate venture capital, for the most part, is desperately broken. And the reason it's so desperately broken is twofold. Number one, it's broken because the people who are, for the most part, leading CVC are people who have a spectacular understanding of the corporate. They understand exactly what the corporate needs and how to work inside the corporate, but they don't really understand venture. They're not really VCs, right? So that's something that what I'm doing right now with Venture University. What we're doing is we're literally taking people and making them investors by giving them money to do real deals, right? But the other thing that's really slowing that's slowing CVCs down is that they simply don't have this mindset of, well, what if I was just a very good client? They start to think, oh, I have to buy this company immediately. Yeah, because I'm a CVC, so I have to buy the company. But the reality is, you shouldn't buy a company, especially as a CVC, right? You shouldn't invest in a company as a strategic CVC. I'm not talking about the financials who are literally just the same as VCs, but as a strategic CVC, you shouldn't buy a company or invest in it if you don't know that what they're doing is really implementable. Implementation. It's about implementation in the corporate, right? And and that's the only way to do that is through this piloting process. And venture clienting is about making that into a reproducible system.
So let's get into it a little bit more deeply. So how does one learn to become a venture capitalist while still holding down their corporate innovation job? How does it start with Venture University? What's the approach you take?
So, by the way, Venture University is where we do train corporate venture capital managers as well. So we've had quite a number come through the program. Most people that join are not CVC managers. The thing that's very unique and why I decided to sign on and bring Venture University, it's already 8 years old in the United States, over to Europe, is Venture University is nothing more than a VC fund. It's a real VC fund. We have $50 million that we manage. We invest 200 to $1 million in different technologies and different companies in 6 different sectors. The thing that's special about it is it's called VU Venture Partners. The people who find our deals are people who actually join our cohorts. Every quarter we accept 40 to 60. This quarter we have 53 venture partners. They actually pay to be inside the fund, but they're full-blown partners in the fund. Like they literally go to every partner meeting, do the due diligence, look at the deals. We give them 100 to 150 deals, and they learn and they take it to the investment committee, and then we decide to invest our money, right? So you can learn. The problem is venture capital as a whole is an apprenticeship business. That's why they often say it's the most expensive training is to train a venture capitalist, because the only way people learn to do venture capital today is by getting in, throwing a lot of money and losing a lot of money, and eventually along the way they figure it out. Venture University is really the first place where you can be inside of a venture capital fund, fully inside, every partner meeting, every investment committee meeting, things you'd have to wait probably 6 years to do if you joined a VC, and really invest 200 to €1 million, but not of your money, right? So and it's the same thing with with corporates. It's even more valuable to them, because a lot of corporates, there's very few. I'm going to say there's 2 kinds of CVCs. There's the ones that invest off the balance sheet. They just take money one at a time and they do deals. And there's others that actually put together a fund, a real fund. Yeah, but most of them are just looking at deals one after the other, and it's very difficult to get the money. It's not always clear, right? A venture capitalist has a certain amount of money and she or he has to invest it. As a corporate, if you're investing off the balance sheet, you only spend the corporate's money when you think it's really a great deal, right?
Right.
So
when you feel like you have a can't miss.
you feel like you have a can't miss. And the problem is that as a corporate VC, and this is really important to understand, no matter how good you would be, you're at a tremendous, tremendous statistical disadvantage, because you're only going to see, by definition, about 30% of the deals that you should see. The reason for that is 70% of startups don't want a corporate on their cap table. They don't want them as a shareholder. So to make it very simple, if I take the money from BMW, and BMW is on my cap table, and now I want to do business with Daimler-Benz, or I want to do business with Tesla, they don't want all the secrets that they're going to be doing to be available to shareholders, and they don't want BMW in there. So 70% of the people will just simply you won't see the deal, right? So you have to be so much better than a regular VC. On the other hand, if you're a client, and that's why this idea of venture clienting is so breakthrough, in my opinion, everybody wants to see you. You see 100% of the deals, because not only does every startup want you as a client, every venture capitalist wants you as a client for their startup, right? Because if you sign a €1 million contract for a year with the startup that I'm invested in, the valuation of that startup might be 10 times revenue, right? So that 1 million is worth 10 million of value on the, to me as a VC. So I definitely want you in. So the client perspective of a corporate is just vastly misunderstood, and and it has to be to live inside of a corporate environment. And I learned this through being 12 years also at Deloitte and building Deloitte Digital Ventures inside of this large mammoth.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be deeply organized, and it has to be measurable. ROI, real ROI. If you can't prove real ROI inside of a corporate 3 years in a row, chances are you'll be fired. That's
Yeah,
not,
well, we know from this show that the average lifespan of a chief innovation officer is 22 months.
and I was being optimistic,
There
obviously.
you go. You gave him 3 years. You're
Yeah.
doing better. But
Yeah.
the other thing I hear, I still remember a senior executive at Discount, which is kind of the Walmart Target of France, who had been in one of the biggest incubators, accelerators in France, had a lot of corporates on campus at this accelerator. And he went to become the head of innovation at Discount and said, I finally figured out what the difference is between working in entrepreneurship and working in corporate innovation. I said, what's that? He said, when I was working with startups, there were two people on an email. The turnaround time was about 30 minutes for each email. And we were able to make decisions like this. He goes, the consequences of those decisions were great for the startup and were pretty much happening in $2 and $4 increments. Now, at a large corporation, I send one email with 40 people CC'd on it. I sit at my desk and I wait 6 weeks while people have conversations around me and then make the same decision over millions of dollars. And so, it's pace, it's scale, it's collaboration, and it drove him insane. He was just like, I can't work at this 6-week interval pace. I want to be like this. But the reality of corporate venturing, or maybe even corporate clienting also, is, the startup it can be in a state of overwhelm. The ability to service a large corporation is not an easy task when you don't have scale at your back.
Yeah, I do a speech called Dancing with Gorillas, which is basically teaching corporates how to dance with the startup, and you're absolutely right. One of the things I say is you can be pretty sure that your legal department is multiple times the size of the entire startup, right?
Right.
So if you don't have a streamlined process for a startup to get signed up and into your system, you'll kill them before they ever can make their first sale.
100%.
And
I
so,
mean, you and I did consulting with Deloitte. It's a 440,000 person company. That's bigger than most cities that startups come from. Like,
that's massive.
it's incredible. So tell us a little bit, can you give us a real world example, Andy, of an investment that you've made and how that worked with a corporate, kind of hand in hand when you're looking at corporate venturing, but also corporate clienting that we talked about?
Yeah. So let me not use, first of all, Venture University VUVP fund, we're a fund, right? So when I talk about we now, I talk about myself as a VC. Yeah. Let's talk about it from a corporate perspective when I was in a corporation. You have, interestingly enough, the whole concept of venture clienting started at BMW. That's where it began. And what they realized was what I was saying before, breakthrough technology comes from startups. They need a standardized way of dealing with them. And the more they started doing that, the more they were able to start saying, what are our most expensive problems, right? And choosing the most expensive problems allows you to say, okay, I want to work with this startup because if I solve that problem, it's worth a massive amount of money to me. And that's why venture clienting actually allows you to do ROI, because you can check. In other words, if I get to market, a year before I was going to get to market otherwise, then I just saved myself a year on the market. That can be worth really tens of millions to a company, right? And so, if you look into BMW today, you'll see things like the way cars are being moved around inside their factories. Okay, that all used to be done by people doing it. Now it's done almost completely through robotics, and the company that set up all the LiDAR and the way they figured out how to do that is a startup that they didn't invest in. They didn't invest in the startup. They don't own the startup. They simply became a client of the startup, and they use it inside their factories. And so, and there's simply, one example after another. But the key thing is the mindset shift that's needed to say, and this is where CVCs sometimes actually get into trouble with the organization. The organization wants a solution. The CVC is often incentivized to make a good investment, right? You need to have a situation where the corporate is driving the relationship with the startup. The nice thing that happens is once you get through a pilot and you actually implement it and you start to, it becomes part of your systems.
Uh-huh.
If that startup, first of all, number one, now you've done your due diligence, right? The number one problem that CVCs have as a CVC is I'm far away from the business unit, very far away from the business unit. And when startups come to me, they need money immediately. And I can't do the due diligence fast enough. I can't do the due diligence like a financial VC is doing it in 2 or 3 weeks because I don't have a business unit to work with, right? So I make a decision without having it. If, however, I have 2 years of working with that company, 2 things are going to happen. Number one, I've done due diligence on it very deeply. I know that it creates ROI for me. And second, I know that I can work with that company. And that's exactly what you were talking about before. We tend to kill startups one after the other, right? Coca-Cola says we're not going to do it because we just kill them. No,
Right.
We know now because we've worked with this company for 2 years that we have a good relationship. They're in our system. They deliver on time. We can deliver on time to them. And now when that company needs money and they do make the decision that they are going to bring a strategic onto the cap table, you can be 100% sure who their first call is. It's not going to be your competitor. It's going to be you to say, do you want to invest in the company? And now you're in a completely different position to invest because you've done the due diligence, you have the proof, you know that it's something that's going to be valued to you. And now you build a portfolio which actually can prove return as well. So you're not going to get thrown out in that 2 to 3 year cycle next time, you're not producing the right kind of numbers that the corporate needs.
So can you distinguish, we've had some really interesting guests from venture studios. Can you distinguish this venture kind of corporate venturing and even this clienting approach versus venture studios?
Yes. Yeah. So a venture studio is essentially a P&L unit in and of itself. In other words, there's people sitting in the studio that do tech support, that do legal, that do sales, that do marketing. One person, like all the P&L functions sit inside of a studio, right? And now what a studio does is a studio looks for entrepreneurs and brings them in, either invests in, and it can be also inside of a corporate. You can do a studio inside of a corporate. You bring ideas in, maybe through your accelerator program, and you build venture studios, build companies inside of corporates. We call it business building, corporate business building. That's actually what I brought to Deloitte. I spent 10 years setting up their business building unit there. And truth be told, venture studios outside of corporate environments are actually quite powerful and work pretty well in a lot of different cases. Inside corporates, they don't really work so well. And the reason that they don't work so well is because it's very difficult for the startup that a corporate is starting to get outside of the compliance and rules and regulations that a corporate has. You can try and do that, but when the corporate owns it, technically it's still underneath all the compliance and independence issues that a corporate is confronted with. So essentially, venture studios build businesses from the ground up with entrepreneurs who are either corporate entrepreneurs or outside entrepreneurs. That's what a studio does. What a VC does, a CVC does, is it simply has a pool of money and invests in companies that they believe that are going to be successful in a corporate environment, typically strategic, meaning it's going to be helpful to me, to my business, to buy or invest in this company. That would be classic corporate venturing. And venture clienting is another unit. It's a standalone unit inside the company, which works best together with a CVC, where there's one person inside the company, usually, who runs the venture client unit. And that unit is purely set up to run pilots, one after the other, with companies that only are venture backed. They don't run pilots with companies if the company doesn't have venture capital. And the reason that they don't do that is because a venture capital backed company, it's like a seal of approval, right? That's what we were talking about before. Venture University, just to give you an idea how crazy the numbers are, we have, just do this math with me, we have 50 people who come and join our cohort every quarter, right? Who come and are accepted. Once you're accepted, you're in the fund, right? Each of those people looks at between 100 to 150 deals a quarter. 100 deals a quarter is really okay for a person in a VC to look at, right? Just because you start to understand quickly, is that the right deal for me or not, right? So now let's just use 100. 100 times 50 is 5,000 in a quarter. And if you do that for 4 quarters, we look at around 20,000 deals a year, and we invest in about 5 every quarter. So 20 out of 20,000. So 1 in 1,000. Talk about the how picky you're able to be. So the venture client unit is piggybacking on that. They're picking companies who have, somebody has gone in, and if you're venture backed, they've gone through you with a fine-tooth comb. They believe you're going to be a massive success, and that's why they're investing the millions in them. The corporates don't have to spend any money on that. They just look and say, oh, it's venture-backed. All of a sudden, the corporates are leveraging literally billions and billions of venture capital by picking companies that are venture-backed, and they're more mature, and they have more, they have support. So this triumvirate of, CVC, together with venture clienting, together with and this is the key piece, together with a leadership of the corporation that understands that breakthrough technology is going to come from a startup. That triumvirate is what really, if you look at Apple and you look at NVIDIA and you look at Google and you look at these companies that are hitting the ball out of the park again and again and again, they all have this triumvirate set up.
Yeah. And they have like business unit leaders who are willing to push through the roadblocks when it gets really tough. So
absolutely,
this is a show about storytelling. So I want to ask a little bit about what is the story that we tell internally to get buy-in? And maybe you can share a little bit about how you help corporate venture teams to craft better investment theses, or how you communicate the innovation opportunity more persuasively, maybe, than we have in the past.
Yeah. So what we talk about, and now I'm really talking about what is VC, right? What's a VC case, right? And this is what you definitely learn and look for at Venture University, inside of our fund. The first part of the story is very simple. What is the margin of improvement compared to the status quo? How big is the margin of improvement compared to the status quo of this new technology that we're looking at? You see, because if it's not massive, then it's incremental, and the corporate probably can do it with their own methods and things like that. They don't have to buy it. So number one, do we have a massive change? Is this going to, massively change the way people react, the way customers buy, things like that? Do I believe that that's the case? Point one, right? Point two, if I look now at that startup and I say, yes, massive change in the way it's done by compared to the status quo today. Second question we ask is, what is the size of the market that we're talking about?
Okay.
Right? Are we transforming a 400 million euro market, which is, if we get 10%, it's going to be a lot of getting a market, and therefore we have 40 million and we're going to now put 20 million in? I don't think so. Right. So the market, but is this going to transform? And now in corporate, how big is the market inside my company that I'm going to, what am I going to change? How much more am I going to sell if I'm on the market 2 years ahead of current plan, right? And now the third thing that we look at is we say, okay, assuming that the margin of improvement is massive, assuming that the market is big enough or massive enough to do that, what's the marketing hack that this company, this startup that I'm thinking about investing in is going to use to actually break into the market? Because here's the thing. As a CVC, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to get them into my own company. The adoption rate, statistically speaking, and this is really horrible news, but the adoption rate of technology from portfolio companies of CVCs inside the companies that are invested in them is less than 10%. Significantly less than 10%. So if I'm investing in this company, I have to believe they have a marketing hack. And what I mean by a marketing hack is one of our general partners was the first at VU Venture Partners was the first check into Venmo, right? You know what Venmo is, right? The payment thing.
Of course.
When in Europe, a lot of people don't know Venmo. So that's why, sorry, I realized I forgot who I'm talking to here. When he invested in Venmo, there were probably 100 companies out there that were just, trying to transfer money. What was the marketing hack that he saw that said, I want to put my money on this one? It was that they were the first company that simply said, all you need to transfer money is your mobile phone number. And that drove traction completely through the roof. So that sort of 3-step of margin of improvement, size of the market, and entry into the market, like I need to believe that as a corporate in spades to actually invest in this thing, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to convince people inside my company that it's really even worth spending the time on.
Sure. So that storytelling means I hear a lot of proof, right? Where, there's some risk associated with it. I'm reflecting on the example of Unilever when it decided to invest in Dollar Shave Club, right? It had never had a direct to consumer offering before. It's a business model shift for them. It's a product shift for them. It was a big deal. They've since gone on to acquire Dr. Squatch, which is another men's grooming product, right? Another direct to consumer brand. But, they've had some bumps along the way. You go from this kind of niche market where you feel like you're in Dollar Shave Club, and then suddenly you're shifting and you're like, welcome to Unilever, one of the biggest conglomerates on the planet.
Yeah.
Right? It's like it almost feels like a disconnect, right? It's like mom and dad trying to be cool by suddenly listening to hip hop music, like out of nowhere. Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and then look at, like, that's one of the questions that a CVC ought to be answering before they make the investment, right? Do I need to integrate this into my company? Right? Like, I mean, look, Instagram is owned by Facebook. They never integrated it, right? I mean, they didn't turn it into Facebook. That was a pretty smart decision when you think about it, right?
Yeah,
So
that would have been a disaster.
That would have been a disaster. And now they have one of the most valuable properties on the planet, right? So it's the same thing. And that's why I think that this venture clienting is so powerful, is because you as the corporate take the pressure off yourself in the beginning about being an investor in a startup. I don't have to be an investor on day one. If I can't become a client, right, then I probably don't want to own them. I can't even work with them. I probably don't want to be on their cap table, because I'll kill it. So, that's, I think, what you're saying is that idea and that ability to understand upfront, what is it? How am I going to interact with this startup? What's the model that I'm going to use? By far and away, the easiest model to use first is just become a client. Just cut a purchase order, have a good pilot, show the ROI to your boss. They say, yeah, you can invest in that. We'll send them a purchase order. And a year down the road, you've got great numbers. And now when the investment round comes, and that's the nice thing about startups, every good startup is raising money every 18 months. So
Mm.
you can be sure you're going to have another opportunity to invest in that company. And I tell you what, and this is something that I really learned and probably wish I had myself done venture university before I did my 52 angel investments, is that it's not really about whether or not it's not about how much you pay for the company. So in other words, just to give you it's about what you believe the company is going to be worth in the future, right? So just as a real life example, we at VU Venture Partners, we invested about 12 months ago into a robotics company, which is basically making humanoid robots, right?
Wow.
And the valuation of the company when we invested next to Amazon and next to Tesla and a bunch of others. It's called Figure AI. It's all public information. The value of Figure AI when we invested was already $2 billion when we invested. If I had before, I would never have invested in a company that late stage because I would say, well, I'm just a little venture company. Why don't I do that? No, if I have a chance to get on a cap table at 2 billion, okay, I'm going to get on because why? Because I believe it's going to be worth 20 billion in 2 or 3 years. Well, what ends up happening? We just invested again in that company, not even 18 months later, and the valuation of the company this time is 30 billion.
Wow.
30 billion, right? Now, and that's what I'm saying as a corporate, there's like all this thinking that goes on sometimes inside CVCs, which is really crazy, which is we shouldn't invest in that. We shouldn't become a client of that company because as soon as we become a client, their market value is going to shoot up and it's going to be much more expensive for us to invest
For us to
later.
get
We should
in,
invest
right?
now, right?
Sure.
That's not the right thinking. What we should be thinking is if I bring breakthrough technology into my company and I can implement it in all the systems that I'm using and I can increase my market share, I don't really care if I ever invest in the company. And by the way, if they're really so successful, 18 months later, then I'll get in the next round. Yeah. And then there's going to be another round, and then there's going to be another round. Right. And so that kind of understanding, and this is really what I see is missing inside of CVCs today is this venture understanding. What is a venture case? Why should I invest in it? How do these companies actually fit into my strategic and or financial goals? Right. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're not trying. What we do at Venture University is we give you our checkbook. You look
Okay.
at the deals,
Mhm.
you bring them through our investment committee, and we write the check. If you want to invest next to us, you're welcome to do that as well.
So, you know, we're coming to the end of our discussion, but I feel like I could talk about this for another hour. I want to ask you a different hot seat question than I ask most of my guests, which is
Oh,
typically I ask people, what is the greatest innovation of all time? And what innovation team would you have loved to have been on given the opportunity? But I want to ask you if you could have been part of any venturing team in history, which would you pick?
meaning any corporate venturing team? Is that what you're saying?
Well, corporate or VC, like what would have been your pick? Because it's not just about the money, right?
No, it's not. It's not just about the money. My answer to your first question, by the way, would have been that I probably would have picked some of the companies that I actually helped to incubate, like a Flixbus, which is now very well known in the United States because they bought Greyhound, and I brought them into my accelerator at the university when they were simply an idea. And I probably would have wanted to have been the partnering. As I think partnering is incredibly undervalued and underdeveloped inside of companies in general. From a venturing team, I guess it would have to still be an Apple or a Facebook, the companies that have really gone out and had the nerve to buy companies that are have changed the world and really understand how to manage them and how to work with them and how to nurture those kinds of people. And they don't get them all right either. So, and maybe on the venture side, I might have early days gone into Benchmark or something like that. But
There you go. Andy, this has been a phenomenal conversation. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, the easiest way is just to look up Venture University and you'll find me on the website there. My email is a little hard to remember. So it's AG, my first name, and VUVP fund. So VUventurepartnerfund.com, just an email. Or they're welcome to write to you, Susan, because you know exactly how to reach me.
Perfecto. Andy Goldstein, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.